So my name is Tristen Hall. I am a third year doctoral student in the Student Affairs and Higher Education program here at Miami University. My work, my dissertation work is largely around relationality among students of color and thinking about how they navigate horizontal oppression and solidarity building. And then I also do work around institutional DEI responses and student activism. And so I guess how I conceptualize my work and my role in DEI work is from, I guess, two distinct but overlapping levels. I think we have the institutional level, which I'm very institutional and organizational level, which I'm interested in, and how do institutions kind of frame and respond or don't respond to DEI concerns. And what does learning from that say about uh, what's effective, or like how much work we still need to do, as well as then I think my own personal work is more centered around the individual level when it comes to DEI, and thinking about um, how can we um, how can we mitigate kind of like the conflict that we find in our interpersonal relationships, and if institutions were to be perfect tomorrow, like what would happen what would happen on an interpersonal level, and how can we address some of those issues and concerns. I came to this work, I think, through really my work in multicultural centers, and like one being, I think, both a witness and a participant in student activism, and seeing, I guess, the role that I guess higher education has, I think, in the larger push for social justice, and like, what happens when you advocate at this institutional for your institution to change, and how does that make you able to think about complex problems outside of higher education. And so doing that work like really helped me think, I guess, about like the role that I wanted to have in it, and I wanted to continue. And it was really interesting, and I love seeing students get like fired up and passionate. Now I don't love seeing them necessarily be like harmed in the process of that. And so I guess that's also where I come in, is because like you need allies or accomplices like on every level, whether that's within school, out of school. And I don't know, I was like, I guess I'm placing myself in this position now as a graduate student and potentially future faculty member as that accomplice, somebody with power in an institutional level. And how can we place people who are going to use power in ways that help advocate for students, um, and that help advocate for communities within those positions as well. I think probably one of the best practices that I can name is truly like just unlearning all of the, I guess, the things that we have come to know before, and how like people um, get to these institutions, and then like what these institutions' role is in being an oppressive force, whether that's within the institution or outside of it. I think something that has been like a really big eye opener for me is, even though I focus on higher ed, like I think a lot about K-12 work too, and that's not like where my area of focus is. But I think something that is really big is thinking about the school to prison pipeline. And oftentimes I feel like in higher ed we see ourselves as like exempt from that, because we haven't done the unlearning of like the ways that higher education institutions can also criminalize students, and also surveil students and things like that. And so I think once you reach that unlearning, you're like, all right, a good institutional shift would be like, how can we divest from campus safety in some of the ways that we have before? How can we not make activism, which is, what my advisor likes to say, a sign of a healthy campus, not make activism a criminalizing or punishable offense, and just different things like that. But without the unlearning first and seeing those connections, it's kind of like, well, how would you know you're not thinking critically about it? And so I think it's the best practice because it's a practice you can always do. Like, it's a practice you can always unlearn more or relearn or break things down. And to me, that's been helpful in seeing like the little pieces. Because a lot of times we're like, we need change. What does change look like? And it's like you have to be able to name exactly what that change is that you want to see. Um, and you have to be able to track down like what its roots are. And so in order to, I think unlearning helps do all of that. One example that I can see is like some of the most recent changes that we've made with requiring like entrance exams, like the GRE and things like that. I think we've come to unlearn that like these entrance exams, one, are classes, they cost money, or elitist, however you want to put it, and then aren't necessarily measuring your success or anticipated success in a graduate program. And so recognizing and unlearning, the things, because that's the exact opposite of what I think we have been told about these entrance exams, and that they're a good measure and something to use. And so now that we've unlearned it, we can change that policy where it's like now it's no longer required for your application. And so I think that's an observable like practice of unlearning and then making a shift to reflect that. And also, I mean, and making that shift, it's kind of like, I think helped, just from what I know about the decisions being made, helped us think about how we can look at students more holistically or look at other aspects of the application process and weigh it differently than we were before. What we have learned, or what we continue, I won't say we have learned it. I would say what we continue to learn from activism is really like students' experiences. I think a lot of times, in BEI work, we are very quick to like quantify things like how many students are in this space, how many students are coming to this institution, how can we get more representation, which makes sense because I mean, diversity is the first word in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think student activism is really a lens into the equity and inclusion piece of like, okay, we have people in the space, or maybe we're gaining the representation that we're looking for, but in what ways are we still not being equitable? In what ways is campus not inclusive? And I mean, that's extremely valuable when you think about it. And we think about like the ways in which that we think about labor, like we don't often think of activism as labor or activism as something, we think about it as noise. Like this is criticism, and criticism isn't great, but there's information in criticism, and it's like we're constantly trying to have that information, I guess, about the temperature of our campus and things like that. And activism is making that known. Now it's hard to hear, but now we have the knowledge about the experiences. We can't say we don't. We can look back at like the cyclical nature of activism and see times and times again the same patterns of things that either are or are not happening. And so I think it's extremely valuable to get that pulse reading on campus. And so that's why I think it's healthy, because if you want to know how you're doing or you want to know how you can improve, just look at your student activism and you can tell a really big story. So I think some opportunities have been like being able to, I guess, utilize my voice within the department, and within the college, and advocating for like classes that we should have, and being actually have the opportunity to teach a class that is geared towards students of color. Um, and our graduate students of color, I should say, and really being able to do some unlearning in that class and thinking about historical context and navigational strategies, and things that like we don't always get to talk about in I guess I would just say like everyday spaces. And so this is a very intentional space that we've been able to curate. And I also having the opportunity to do that work with graduate students of color as well. Um, and so that's something that I've really appreciated, because I mean, that speaks a lot to the work I'm trying to do or the research that I'm trying to do. And I think similarly, a challenge in that work as well is like, it's hard kind of opening up the lens into something that you're also experiencing at the same time, and teaching. So the course is for mostly for master's students, though there have been some doc students who have taken the course. And so it's like we are both part of the problem or not part of the problem, but like experiencing the problem and sometimes part of the problem, and trying to get out of it as well, and trying to empower each other through it. And so that's a different type of like cognitive dissonance to sit in, on any given day. And so I'd say that's a unique challenge of having the opportunity to do that work. It's so hard. I'm gonna say this and it's gonna be like, wait, you're contradicting yourself. And so I'm naming that right now. Providing spaces to like listen and hear out graduate students, and like actually, I mean, we have lots of, I think, knowledge and things to bring in a unique perspective, and finding ways to do that without it being a form of additional labor too. I think that there are ways, just like we were talking about activism, and there are ways to glean that information without necessarily having it be like, let's host a listening session. That might not necessarily be the most effective. It might be more labor intensive on graduate students. However, I think if you're looking at the work that we're doing, at our papers and like things that we're already contributing, I think you can find some of the answers that were always like, oh, let's ask grad students about this. And so like, let's be creative. Let's be creative and find ways to like use the knowledge we're already producing to help better our departments and things like that, without it being, an additional 3-hour meeting that I don't think, honestly, okay, maybe this isn't the right space for this, but that either party necessarily wants to be in, because it's an uncomfortable experience to have to sit on either side and say like, we're not getting enough of this. And I don't think it's easy if you don't necessarily have the resources to be able to do anything about the issue at the time, because there's a lot of issues that we can raise, and like reality still sets in, and there's only so many funds, there's only so many resources, there's only, you know what I mean? And so it's it can be uncomfortable to have to like then listen to what students are expressing, and then to have to be like, that was great, thank you so much for sharing, and I actually can't do anything about that right now.
Mm.
And so that's not, you know what I mean, like that's not always helpful. So I'm thinking of just like, how can we listen to grad students as more of like a collective than as like individual pinpointing of people. And Ohio, I guess, is a really unique state, and where like I didn't know this before, I learned this actually recently, where graduate students can't have a union or can't unionize. That's not like, there's not much that the institution can do about that. But learning and unlearning things like that is I guess helpful, because it's like, now how I guess we are experiencing the work that we're also trying to change, at the same time, how we're experiencing doing the work, or experiencing being in a place, in a state where you're not allowed to unionize, and trying to advocate for yourself and for students and faculty alike. So I just will add that tidbit in at the end. I wish there were like, it's more like a wishful thinking than a concrete solution, but I think it's important to name too.